A few caveats before I fire up the PowerPoint. So one is that if that Darwin-Morgan paper had any merits to it, it's partially due to the really, really spectacular editorial work of Greg. So that was one of the most rewarding sort of paper writing experiences, partially through that interaction. The other caveat, well, two more. I'm on the West Coast, so it's early here. So if I just trail off, someone blare an air horn at me or something. But I think I'm up. And then the third thing is that I was a little bit reticent to share this project with you because, frankly, it's been giving me fits. And I thought, should I give something that's a little bit more dialed in or that I am more comfortable with? And I thought, you know what? No. If anyone in the world can tell me why what I'm saying is wrong, it's someone in this audience at least. So I will just fall on that sword. And so I'm giving you this project that I'm kind of uncertain about certain parts of, but I'm really eager to have your feedback. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. And let's see if it works. All right, I think we're, come on, gonna be good to go. Okay, great. So I hope you can all see this and kind of see me at the same time over here in the corner. I should say that given this setup when I'm sharing a screen, I can't really see much in a chat or hands raised, I don't think. So if I'm not responsive to you, that's the reason why, and not just like my big-headedness. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling Darwin's causal argument against creationism. So famously, Darwin characterized the origin of species as his one long argument. Now, any good argument is going to sort of consist of two parts, right? So the first part, the project he undertakes in the origin, is to provide internal support for his theory, right? So he's going to argue that the components of natural selection, variation, a struggle for existence, and so on, exist in natural populations, and to argue that they would be sufficient to explain the adaptations and diversity that we see in the natural world. Now, in addition to showing that his view, sort of natural selection exists, he wants to show that it's responsible for these outcomes rather than some alternative, right? So positive support for his theory and also arguments against competitors, right? So he wants to show that, in fact, the mechanism he identifies as responsible for speciation and adaptation, and that other alternatives, particularly special creationism, can't explain those outcomes as well. So in this talk, I'm largely going to be focusing on his negative arguments against competing theories. Now, in the origin, Darwin vacillates between largely incompatible lines of attack on special creationism, as we'll explore. And at this point in his career, he expresses that on the sort of question of God and its relationship to evolution, he says, "I am and shall ever remain in a hopeless muddle." And I think it's a good assessment of his treatment of special creationism in the origin, largely. But a little bit of what I'm seeing is that it seems like this muddle gets significantly resolved for Darwin over the next, say, 20-some years. And so what I want to do is talk about what I'm thinking might be a significant change in Darwin's views regarding the question of God and evolution from the origin all the way until his death. So here are some of the works that I'm drawing on. So there's The Origin of Species in 1859, and an elaboration of his views throughout the Orchids and Variation under Domestication. A lot of these changing views were developed in conversation in a very famous correspondence with Asa Gray, the American botanist. So I'll be pulling a bit on Asa Gray's writings, both in his letters to Darwin and in a series of papers, which is collected in his Darwiniana book. I should just say it was really nice to go back through these Darwin and Gray letters because they do a lot of really interesting philosophy, but they also talk about like geeking out about plants and how screwed up American politics is right around the time of the Civil War and how tired they are. So like it was just deeply relatable content at the moment in the US. So here's the argument that I would like to push, which is that Darwin, over the course of his career, switches from one main argumentative strategy in the origin to another main argumentative strategy in later works. So in the origin, Darwin's attacks on special creationism largely take this form, which I'll call the argument from imperfection. So if traits were specially created, then we would expect them to have a function and that their function would fit their current use, right? So they would appear to be sort of designed for the function that they're put toward in that organism. However, many traits do not have functions or have functions that do not fit their current use, and therefore traits are not specially created. Whereas in later works, especially in variation, Darwin relies on a different argument, which I'll call the argument from independence, which says if traits were designed, then variation would not be random with respect to fitness. However, variation is random with respect to fitness, so therefore traits are not designed. We'll unpack these in much more detail, but for now, I just want to say, here's my sort of goal in the paper: to understand why Darwin, and indeed Gray, thought that the independence argument was far more compelling than the imperfection argument, right? Why did he shift from one to the other? And then I want to provide sort of a rational reconstruction of why the argument from independence is a better argument than the argument from imperfection. Try to take a stab at redeeming Darwin's argument here. And one tool I'm going to use is to sort of look at today's causal modeling theory, to see if we can sort of generate a version of the independence argument that's sort of compelling to us today, just from general principles of causal inference. So those are the goals. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk through the argument from imperfection and some of its limitations that Darwin himself realized. Secondly, talk about the argument from independence. Then we're going to back up and talk about a few principles of causal inference. Then I'm going to apply those to try to interpret the argument from independence, and then have some, as of yet, tentative conclusions that I hope to make less tentative through this talk. Okay. So throughout this talk, I'm going to start depicting different views of God's relationship to the natural world via sort of causal diagrams, which represent sort of the causal structure that's posited by the theory. Okay. So special creationism holds that roughly every species that we see and all of their traits were the results of separate sort of creative acts by God. I just realized I'm getting this cool like David Bowie light in my eyes, so I'm going to take care of that real quick. Okay, there you go. Well, it's still here, but that's all right. It's good to talk about special creationism while there's a beam of light right in your face. Anyway, so special creationism holds that every trait that we see is the result of a separate act of God's creation. So we can sort of model it this way, that every trait is resulting from a distinct creative act. And here what I mean by this God variable is something like some specific action by God with some specific goal, right, that he has in mind. So in the origin, the evaluation of the special creation hypothesis pretty much focuses on the plausibility of these independent causal links that it posits, right? So we might ask, for some trait that we see, is there a plausible causal connection between God's intentions and the trait we observe? Or alternatively, are there plausible causal connections between other causes, candidate causes, and the trait we observe? Right, so focusing on the plausibility of individual acts of creation. So for example, we can cash out Hayley's design argument as follows, where Hayley argues that if it were chance that we're the cause of the traits we see, it would be really improbable that we would see traits that were complex and had a function and were delicate, where delicate means sort of like the parts are complexly arranged such that if you change them or remove them, we would no longer perform the function. Whereas on the other hand, Hayley thinks that it's quite probable that if God created traits, God who has foresight and is beneficent, then we would expect all those traits to have those properties. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to move my display so I can. Okay, so the claim is that a trait having a clear function and having parts arranged so as to perform that function is evidence of design. So what's Darwin's sort of response to this? So we can start by looking at sort of what the most common response is that we have today to this argument. So this is called the imperfection argument, or what Professor Raddick terms the no designer worth his salt objection. So you might respond and say, look, well, if you're supporting this view of special creation by showing that there are sort of perfect, well-functioning traits, the existence of imperfect, not well-functioning traits would seem to be evidence against the theory. Okay, so famously, right, the panda, if intelligently designed, would have probably opposable thumb, and instead the panda merely has a sort of spur of bone that it uses as a rudimentary thumb. You would think, right, that there's no plausible causal connection between God's intentions and this thumb, because if God were the one causing it, then we would expect it to be better. My other sort of favorite example of imperfect design is that the nerve that controls your larynx only probably has to be a few inches long, but in fact, it goes all the way down around your heart and back up to your brain. And so this nerve in a giraffe is something like 17 feet long, even though it only has to be probably 6 inches long, right? So Darwin actually takes this imperfection argument a step further and argues not on the basis of traits that are imperfectly designed, but ones that seem to have no function at all, right? So he takes this to be an even more compelling argument against the idea that they were created by a God who had a purpose for them. So Darwin first argues from rudimentary traits. So he argues on the view of each organic being and each separate organ having been specially created, how utterly inexplicable it is that its parts, like the teeth in the embryonic calf or the shriveled wings under the soldered wing covers of some beetles, would thus so frequently bear the plain stamp of inutility. He also argues for what we might call mismatched traits. Okay, so these are traits in which the current form of the trait doesn't seem to match what it's currently being used for. So he says, he who believes that each being has been created as we see it now must occasionally have felt surprise when he has met with an animal having habits and structure not in agreement. What can be plainer than that the webbed feet of ducks and geese are formed for swimming, yet they are upland geese with webbed feet which rarely go near the water? On the other hand, he argues, on the view of each species constantly trying to increase in number, with natural selection always ready to adapt to the slowly varying descendants of each occupied and ill-occupied place in nature, these facts cease to be strange, or perhaps might even have been anticipated. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to continue to fix this lighting issue. There we go. When the sun doesn't cooperate, we'll go artificial. Okay. So we can see Darwin arguing as follows, right? When you examine the particular causes of the traits we see, for imperfect traits, it's quite probable that natural selection and common ancestry would result in traits that have no function or are mismatched, whereas it's improbable that God, who has foresight and is beneficent, would create those traits. Okay, so again, this positive or negative is a promotion or an inhibition kind of thing. So I think this sort of sums up the general kind of strategy from Darwin and the origin. If function and delicacy and complexity and whatever is evidence of design, then a lack of function should be evidence against it. So for Darwin's argument from imperfection to work, the following three things need to be the case. First, the assumption that if special creations have functions needs to hold. Secondly, the assumption that if special creationism is true, there will probably be fitting of traits to their current purposes. And lastly, that we can actually assess whether traits have a function and fit their function or not, right? That we're justified in judging that a trait lacks a function. Now, by Darwin's lights in the origin itself, in his muddle, all of these assumptions are questionable, right? He doubts every single one of these. So for example, he doubts C, that we can judge whether some trait lacks a function or is mismatched. So he says this in the origin, I believe, when he's talking about the giraffe's little tail or eyebrows. He says, look, it's hard to see how this could be fit or have a function, but we're really bad at judging which things have a function. In the first place, we are much too ignorant in regard to the whole economy of any one organic being to say what slight modifications would be of importance or not. So it might look like something lacks a function, like the wings of that beetle, but who knows? Maybe there is one that we just haven't judged yet. Similarly, Darwin cast doubts on conditions A and B. So for example, suppose that you want to pin it on the special creationism that if special creationism is true, then all traits should have functions. Well, if that's your assumption about God, then it looks like the causal link between God's intentions and the peacock's tail is implausible, right? Because peacock's tails don't really have functions for survival, and they cause them to get eaten by tigers and stuff all the time. However, the special creationists would largely reject this assumption in this case, and historically they did. They said, look, actually, no, I deny that all traits will have functions if my view is true. God has other intentions. So perhaps God also intends traits to be beautiful, in which case, now we can reestablish the plausibility of a causal link between God's intentions and the peacock's tail. So Darwin acknowledges that condition A is going to be denied in many cases by special creationists. And here's what he says about it. He says, well, some naturalists believe that numberless structures have been created for the sake of mere variety and beauty. That such useless organs were not remnants retained by the principle of inheritance, but were specially created and arranged in their proper places, like dishes on a table by an omnipotent hand to complete the scheme of nature. So that's going to be the move. He's dismissive of this. He's dismissive of naturalists who think that the designer creates for the sake of symmetry or to complete the scheme of nature. But this seems to be no explanation, merely a restatement of the fact, right? So he acknowledged at the same time, well, you can pull this move and save special creationism, but at the risk of making special creationism explanatorily vacuous. Likewise, he notes that special creationists will probably reject condition B, that if there's an intelligent designer or creator, then we should see that all traits are perfectly adapted to their current purposes. So it was known, of course, in Darwin's time and before Darwin's time, that the, say, forelimbs of humans and bats and whales and monkeys all have an extremely similar form, despite the very different purposes that they're put to, swimming or flying or grabbing, okay? So you might think, well, look, the whale's arm is not perfectly adapted to its current purposes, so do we have evidence against design? Well, one reply by the creationists is the following. So you might think, well, look, no, we shouldn't expect perfect fit to each environment because God, in his simplicity and unity, creates from a general archetype that he adapts for each purpose. So you can accommodate a failure of a one-to-one matching between form and function. Okay, so this is sort of his causal model. God creates an archetype of the vertebrate forelimb, and then modifies that for the use of each species. Okay. So the point is, Darwin sees that the creationist has outs, and acknowledges that this would seem to undermine the argument from imperfection. Now, I think what Darwin is doing is sort of zeroing in on what we now would call the preference problem, which is to say that creation or intelligent design hypotheses tend to be moving targets. So here's how Roger White puts the preference problem. It's also been discussed at length by Sober. In order to make any predictions about what we would observe if the design hypothesis were true, we first need to know what the designer's goals and capacities are, right? So with respect to the peacock's tail, if you've got one view of God, that God wants to give species what's good for them in getting on in the world, then we would not expect to see the peacock's tail. But if you change your views about what God wants and says that he wants to promote beautiful things, then we can predict that the peacock's tail would result. So why is this a problem? The problem is that unless we can provide some state of affairs that any designer, flawed designer, right, regardless of their intentions, would be likely to create, then the design or special creation hypothesis only seems to make predictions if it sticks its neck out as to the nature of the designer. Conversely, if one is always allowed to attribute any goals to the designer, then the creation hypothesis is consistent with any possible observation and therefore can't be tested or falsified. Okay? And worse, Darwin's like, you can always change your views about the creator's intentions, and we don't seem to have independent access to what the creator would do. Okay? We don't really know what God's purported intentions are, so you can always change them, and if you change them, you can get them to fit any data whatsoever. So sometimes motivated by this sort of dialectic, Darwin takes this sort of other approach, which is to say the problem with special creation isn't that it makes any false predictions. The problem is that it's explanatorily vacuous. Okay? So it says, on the ordinary view of the independent creation of each being, we can only say that it is so, that it is so pleased the creator to construct each animal and plant. That's just a restatement of the fact, not an actual prediction or explanation. And he says to Gray, not in 2857, that would be not foresight, but hindsight, in 1857, for to my mind to say that species were created so-and-so is no scientific explanation, only a reverent way of saying it is so-and-so. So Darwin in The Origin seems to be stuck between these two lines of thought about special creationism. In the parlance of 1980s philosophy of science, I'm kind of picking on Michael Roos here, who, when he testified against creation science in McLean versus Arkansas, asserted both of these claims. But on the one hand, we can say the hypothesis of special creation has been falsified by rudimentary traits. And then on the other side of your mouth, saying that the hypothesis of special creationism is unfalsifiable, right? So Darwin's stuck between these sort of two horns of attacks on special creationism. On the one hand, has it made false predictions with respect to traits? Or on the other hand, is it that it makes no predictions whatsoever and is therefore untestable and unscientific? Okay. I think there might be ways to navigate these two claims at the same time, but you can see that they're prima facie problematic. So one way that you could get out of this, and that Darwin seems to flirt with in The Origin, or does flirt with in The Origin, and Gray adopts wholesale, is to say, look, we can get rid of the preference problem by not positing separate acts of creation for every single trait, right? When you do that, you have way too many adjustable parameters, and you can always make your creation hypothesis accommodate whatever the observations are. And Gray says what you should instead do to be a more scientifically respectable theist is to posit that God set up the evolutionary process, and the evolutionary process created the traits in pretty much this way that Darwin describes, right? So if this is the case, then you get rid of some of the preference problems. So you only have one link now between God and some effect, which is the evolutionary process. And now you have a unified and testable sort of set of causal links between that evolutionary process and the resulting traits. Okay, so you might introduce some preference problem worries, but not all of the ones that the creationists have. So the only remaining questions we have now to ask are, would God create via the evolutionary process? Is there a plausible connection between God's intentions and the laws of evolution? And secondly, would the resulting traits still count as design if God designs via this secondary cause? Okay, is this a means of actual design and creation? And initially, around the time of the writing of The Origin, Gray says yes, okay? And Darwin seems to as well. So on the question of would God create the laws of evolution and create this way, right? Darwin famously says, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes, like those determining the birth and death of the individual, right? And likewise, Gray says, and this is a perfectly legitimate way for God to design. He says, secondary causes don't typically undermine the inference of design, right? If I create a widget by hand, that's no more designed than if I build a machine that creates widgets, okay? So we should think of evolution as sort of like the machine that God made to create widgets. This metaphor got out of hand. Right, so he says, I believe this is in the 1860 Atlantic Review of the Origin, says the adoption of a derivative hypothesis and of Darwin's particular hypothesis would leave the doctrines of final causes, utility, and special design just where they were before. Darwin's hypothesis concerns the order and not the cause, the how and not the why of the phenomena. Okay. So at the sort of end of this debate, Darwin's kind of stuck between these two interpretations of what we should think, and Gray seems to think that theistic evolution is the way out. But this sort of wary détente gets interrupted with sort of the argument from independence. Okay, so I think to start motivating this argument from independence, we need to revisit how we're modeling the theistic evolution theory. Okay, so we put it this way, where God sets up the evolutionary process and that's responsible for our traits. But in fact, I think that lumping together a bunch of things under the evolutionary process is misleading, right? So we know that what evolutionary process or natural selection means is that there's variation, there is selection acting on that variation, and that variation is heritable. And that itself causes the traits that increase in frequency or adaptations, okay? So I think a first step is to sort of unpack what does this evolution variable means? And I've just focused on two such variables. A side note, I'm not sure this is the right way to causally model any of this, but I think it'll help to see it, right? So for God to create by evolution, God would be setting up the processes of variation and selection and heredity and letting those create traits. And Gray thinks this is totally compatible with how God creates. The way we should think of God creating is by God creating variations that will ultimately be good for organisms to have, right? God creates by seeding mutations and variations that will eventually evolve. So he says, wherefore, so long as graded, orderly, and adapted forms in nature are new design, and at least while the physical cause of variation is utterly unknown, we should advise Mr. Darwin to assume that variation has been led along certain beneficial lines. Streams flowing over a sloping plane by gravitation may have worn their actual channels as they flowed, yet their particular courses may have been assigned. When we see them forming definite and useful lines of irrigation, after a manner unaccountable in the laws of gravitation dynamics, we should believe that the distribution was designed. Right, so Gray's view is that God creates traits by intervening on variations to give them variations that will ultimately be fit and therefore better for us to have. And Darwin replies to this, and I think you start getting the seeds of his growing agnosticism. So his first point is that when you look at the statistics, most variations are injurious or neutral. So if God's designing variation, he seems to be putting a lot of bad mutants in the pool. He also responds to Gray after reading this review. He says that variation has been led along certain beneficial lines. I cannot believe this, and I think you would have to believe that the tail of the fantail pigeon was led to vary in the number and direction of its feathers in order to gratify the caprice of a few men. Yet if the fantail had been a wild bird and used its abnormal tail for some special end, everyone would have said what a beautiful and designed adaptation. Again, I say I am and shall ever remain in a hopeless muddle. So let's unpack these sort of two responses that Darwin has, his reticence to say that variation is guided. So the first one is sort of how we think about it today, right? How we judge whether mutations are random with respect to fitness. So we say now that variation is independent with respect to selection. And by that we mean that the probability of getting some mutation, given that it would be fit, is identical to the probability of getting that mutation given that it's unfit, right? So it's not as if like the fact that something would be good for me to have makes it any more likely it will emerge, right? So here's a simple test you could do. You could take a bacterial colony, split it into a green background and a red background. Suppose on the green background, green is fit. On the red mutants are fit. And you would test to see whether or not there is a difference in which mutations arise in which setting, right? If red mutations are more likely to arise in the red background or green are more likely to arise in the green background, then you've got evidence that variation is biased towards fitness. And we don't actually see that. Now, this sort of statistical argument for why variation is random with respect to fitness is in the Darwin a little bit, but mostly what we got from Darwin was a different kind of argument. So he argues that the reason we should think that selection is independent of variation is that we as humans, as breeders, can intervene on selection and switch resultant trait values, right? So he says, if you started by, you have a population and you want to breed for these like big chests and kind of tumbler necks, you can do so. But then if you stop and change your mind and want to go in the opposite direction and make these long skinny necked pigeons, you can also do so. And the claim is that since it seems like there's the opportunity for us to change which way we drive evolution here, then it can't be the case that variation was pushing in one specific direction, right? Variation is random with respect to what we want to do, right? If variation was guided towards skinny-necked pigeons, it wouldn't make sense that we could push them the other way. That seems to be the argument. We can hold variation and intervene on selection and change traits. On the other hand, he also thinks that we can hold selection fixed and we can sort of intervene on variation, right? So if you hold the selected environment fixed and you increase the population size, you increase the probability that you're going to get beneficial traits. If you reduce the population size, the opposite might happen, okay? He's got these cool thought experiments somewhere in Variation Under Domestication where he imagines what would happen if sort of different breeders across the world kept sort of pigeon populations and had no selection. And he argues that you would see the exact same variance basically in both of those populations, which is to say that variation doesn't pay attention to what use they'll be put toward. Okay. So this sort of culminates in Darwin's independence argument that you find in Variation Under Domestication. So his key fact is that variation is random with respect to fitness. So the probability of variation arising is independent, whether it would be good and bad. And his famous metaphor to picture this is as follows. So imagine you come across a wall, maybe in the English countryside, separating some fields, and you see that the stones of the wall fit together perfectly. Should we assume that these stones were put there because they would fit together or not? And he says, the fragments of stone, though indispensable to the architect, bear to the edifice built by him the same relation which the fluctuating variations of organic beings bear to the varied and admirable structures ultimately acquired by their modified descendants. The shape of the fragments of stone at the base of our precipice may be called accidental, but this is not strictly correct, for the shape of each depends on a long sequence of events, all obeying natural laws. But in regard to the use to which the fragments may be put, their shape may be said to be accidental. Okay, so the idea is that there's a separate causal process that created the stones, and that's separate from the intentions of the builder, right? So both of them are caused, but they're random with respect to each other. And what the builder selection does is put the stones together that it sees fit, and probably leaves a lot of stones behind that didn't fit into the wall. So here's sort of the crux of the argument. So can we think that the creator sort of intentionally ordered that certain fragments of rock should assume certain shapes? He says this: if the various laws which have determined the shape of each fragment were not predetermined for the builder's sake, can it be maintained with any greater probability that he specially ordered for the sake of the breeder each of the innumerable variations in our domestic animals and plants, often which are bad for creatures? And he says, well, if we give up the principle in one case, if we do not admit that the variations of the primeval dog were intentionally guided in order that the greyhound might be formed, no shadow of reason can be assigned for belief that variations, alike in nature and the result of the same general process, I can't read the bottom of this, were designed. Okay? So it's an interesting argument, right? It's kind of hard to see what's support for what. Is a metaphor support for the claim? I think that, again, idea is that in artificial selection, right, when we create a greyhound, we don't think that sort of God biased that variation so that we can make greyhounds. And the reason is that if we took that population and instead of pushing it in the greyhound direction, instead of push it in the bulldog direction, we could go that direction too, right? It seems like there's sort of freedom for selection to create what it wants rather than being tightly constrained by variation. And this is sort of Darwin's going back to the well. He thinks if he can prove something holds in the case of artificial selection, that he can prove that it holds in the case of natural selection. Okay. So this is sort of like the topic of conversation now over the course of, say, like 13 years with Asa Gray. Darwin and Gray both agree that if variation is not biased, then the outcomes of evolution are not designed at all. Not merely that the designer didn't act through special creation, but they think that this would obliterate the inference of design more generally. They also agree that the independence argument is more compelling than the imperfection argument. So Darwin, in his autobiography, says, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. I've discussed this subject at the end of my book on the variation of domesticated animals and plants, and the argument there has never, as far as I can see, been answered. Right? So Gray also says, when I see the force of this objection, I feel the cold chill, right? I understand how bad this is for me. Okay, so the question is why? Why is the independence argument good, and why is it better than the previous argument we looked at? So to do that, let's step back for a minute and talk about some principles of causal inference. So in like broad strokes, we can think about two general approaches to thinking about causation. So a process account evaluates causes as causes generating their effects, right? So Elizabeth Anscombe is one of the key figures. She says causality consists in the derivativeness of an effect from its cause. Effects arise out of or come out of their causes. So on this approach to causality, to evaluate a causal claim, you look at the plausibility of individual causal links, right? Could A have produced B? And in the philosophy of science, you see quite a few sort of elaborations of this view. So you might think, is there a mechanism of contact that connects A and B? Would this agent have produced this action? Or does A transmit a mark to B or whatever? So I think that sort of the design argument and the argument for imperfection are largely utilizing this approach. You're asking for a particular causal link. Would this God's intention create this trait? Would this arise out of this cause? And this is what generates the preference problem. Because when you're only focused on a particular act of God, you need to know, right? Would God's intention promote this trait? And what are God's intentions? But there's a different sort of way to approach causation, which is what we're going to call the regularity account. Okay, so on the regularity account of causation, causal relations are sort of constituted by patterns of association or succession. So sorry, someone has their mic on, by the way. Sorry. Okay, thanks. So on this view, to evaluate some causal claim is to test for patterns of correlation, of probabilistic dependence or independence. And you don't need to know the knowledge of a mechanism. So one example is continental drift, right? Wegener knew that continental drift was happening because of the correlation between, say, South America and Africa, but he didn't know how it was possible. So on the mere fact of correlation, infer there was a causal relation before we could know how A could produce B. So this is Hume's view. Causation is just a constant conjunction. And we're going to talk about how this regularity view has become sort of the dominant account of causation and causal inference today. Okay. So today's sort of Spirides, Gliamarchinus, and Judea Pearl kind of accounts of causal inference characterize the causal inference problem as follows. So you have a set of variables. You find the probability distribution, the patterns of dependence and independence across variables, and you find the causal relations consistent with the observed probability distribution. So the general rules that we use are as follows. So the principle of a common cause says that anytime there's a probabilistic correlation between A and B, there's some causal relation. Either A causes B, B causes A, or they have a common cause. This further got articulated into the causal Markov condition, which says that if there's a causal arrow from A to B, then conditional on A, B is independent of all their variables. That basically just says if there's a common cause between A and B, knowing about that, once you know about the common cause, this correlation disappears. Okay, so parents screen off their descendants from one another. And lastly, there's this faithfulness condition, which is that if A and B are causally connected, then they will be dependent with one another. So here's a silly example. Suppose that I'm trying to figure out what's causing an increase in the murder rate in my town. And here are the four variables that I know. There's the temperature outside, there are ice cream sales, there's my murder rate, and there are the violence in music lyrics, something like that. So I observed that there are correlations between ice cream sales and murder rate and temperature, and lyrics, the sort of violence of music lyrics is unrelated, it's uncorrelated with the murder rate. Well, I can use these principles to infer what the causal structure is. So principle of common cause says there's got to be some causal relation among the variables that are related. However, it turns out that once I know about the temperature, right? Once I've fixed what the temperature is, knowing about the ice cream sales no longer tells me anything more about the murder rate, right? These are independent once I know about the temperature. So we can infer by the causal Markov condition that temperature is the common cause of ice cream sales and the murder rate. And by faithfulness, we can infer that lyrics don't actually cause the murder rate because they're uncorrelated. So these are sort of the rules of our causal graph. The principle of common cause says that if two things are dependent, then they're causal. And faithfulness says if two things are independent, then they're not causal. Okay, so these tools are in wide use, both in philosophy, but also in the actual world to infer the causal structure of the world. Can we use these tools of causal inference to go back and look at those causal hypotheses we started with? So I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the conversations about how they apply to special creationism. We can go back to that if we want. But let's start with sort of theistic evolution. So on the initial way of modeling this, it looks like it's in pretty good shape, because the causal Markov condition implies screening off, right? That causal parents screen off their effects from more distant ancestors. So this would seem to say that once you have the evolutionary process in place, adding God at the beginning doesn't change your predictions whatsoever. God is probabilistically irrelevant to the traits once you've taken care of evolution. So it seems like the sort of standard evolutionary model and this model would make all the same predictions. So it looks like it's in good shape. But here's how I want to use these sort of causal modeling insights to try to redeem the argument from independence. So recall that the chief argument here is that variation and selection are random with respect to each other, that they're independent of each other, they're uncorrelated. Okay? There's no correlation between what mutants arise and what would be good to have. Well, the faithfulness assumption says that if two variables are uncorrelated with each other, then there's no causal relation among them. Okay? If they had a common cause, they would be correlated, but they don't. So one way to cash out this argument is just the fact of randomness plus the faithfulness assumption would seem to entail that there's no God at the beginning of the process. And we can sort of rule that out on the basis of general causal inference alone. So here's maybe a formalization of the argument. Faithfulness says if two variables are unconditionally independent, there's no causal relationship between them, nor are they joint effects of a common cause. Variation and selection are conditionally independent, therefore there's no causal relationship between them, and there's no joint effects of a common cause. So a first conclusion is that there's no unified cause of evolutionary processes. There are two separate causal pathways. Well, if the outcomes of evolution are designed, then they must trace back to a particular type of cause, a unified intention or goal. But because there can be no unified cause, therefore the outcomes of evolution are not designed. That's my stab at trying to present a redemption of this argument. And we can see why you would think it's an improvement over the imperfection argument, because it doesn't have any of the same flaws, right? So the argument from imperfection said, you have to be able to reason about what the creator would do. Well, this doesn't require that. It follows from general causal principles without having to make any assumptions about what the designer is like. Furthermore, it doesn't rely on us making any judgments about trait functions, at least at this step of the argument. So one thing I think at this point I just want to pause and say, you might think that we've solved the preference problem by just saying, no matter what the designer is like, or even what kind of cause the designer is. We have ruled it out on general causal principles that there can be any cause standing at the beginning of the process. But now I want to consider the last few slides here, some objections. So we know that faithfulness can be violated. Sometimes two things can be independent, but there is a causal relationship between them. So the famous example is that birth control pills cause blood clots, but they are uncorrelated with blood clots. And the reason is that birth control pills cause blood clots, but they also reduce pregnancy, which causes blood clots. And if these paths cancel out, so there are causal relationships, but they don't result in an overall correlation. So maybe God could violate faithfulness. The first objection goes. Maybe God set things up so that these two variables perfectly are random with respect to each other, but still designs that way. So the question is, could God design through these two random processes, and would he? So Darwin's first reply seems to be, look, if God wants what's best for us, and is taking such an inefficient means to his end, what a brutal way for God to design, right? To just give variations are totally random with respect to whether they be good or bad. If you want us to have good things, why would you set stuff up that way, right? So think about what it would take for malaria defense to evolve. You have to wait for some random mutation. The things that don't have it die. It takes a really long process with things dying, and finally you get this good trait at the end. Looks like it's pretty evil for God to have worked that way when he could have worked more efficiently. Now, there's a problem with that, which is that falls prey to the preference problem. Now you're assuming that God wants to take efficient means to his ends and is beneficent. Here's another way you could spin the argument, which is to say, regardless of what a designer is like, here's one thing we know about designers. They take non-random means to their ends. If anything is constitutive of agency, it's that you take a means to your end that promotes that end, is not random with respect to it. So in this way, it would be like God trying to achieve some goal for us by rolling the dice or flipping a coin. And sure, agents do that, but we do it when we're trying to mask our intentions from the final goal. We flip a coin so that none of my intentions make its way into the final result. Okay, so I guess the response here to the preference problem is, no matter what kind of designer God is, no designer takes random means to its ends. I'm not sure this is correct as a response. Sometimes we do take random means to our ends. So if you imagine playing Scrabble and you're trying to, say, make the word truck, instead of sorting through and picking them out of the bag, you might just dump them all on the table and select them out, right? So maybe God is dumping all the mutations on the table and selecting them out, and that's the most efficient way for him to work. So at this point in the argument, right, the argument is, does God violate faithfulness? That would be a weird way to design, but maybe it's a possible way. Last bit of the argument. Here's another objection you can make to say that design is compatible with random variation. So Elliot Sober got in hot water for making this argument, where he says, look, the laws of evolution contain macro level statistical probabilities. Those macro level statistical probabilities do not rule out the possibility of hidden variables. So therefore, the laws of evolution do not rule out the possibility of God. Right? So let's walk through an example of this. So suppose that you've got two coins that are probabilistically independent. The probability of getting coin one heads, given that the second one is they're independent, right? Probably with heads on one doesn't affect the other one. So you might think that if these two are totally independent, then they don't have a common cause. However, suppose that getting heads on flip 4 on both is extremely fortuitous. Is it possible for God to have determined those particular flips without breaking the overall statistical randomness of these two coins? And Sober's argument is yes. Right? The fact that on the whole these two are independent doesn't preclude that particular instances God had a hand in. Okay? So maybe mutations are random with respect to fitness, but some really important mutations God went in and fiddled with. So Gray acknowledged this as a possibility. Maybe God set up these random processes, but now and then and only now and then puts his hand directly to the work. Or maybe he set up these random processes so they align in fortuitous ways. Okay, so here are some tentative conclusions. These are the less tentative ones. I think the argument from independence does not entail, logically, the lack of design. God could design through random processes, thus violating faithfulness, and high-level randomness could conceal lower-level intervention by God. But I take that Darwin's argument is good in that independence severely constrains God's activity if God has to work within the parameters of random variation, such that this independence is very strong evidence against any overarching design to the biological world, right? If it constrains God, then God has to work with really narrow parameters such that the most plausible hypothesis is God's not designing that way at all. Some theses I'd like to argue for more assertively is that we see over the course of his career Darwin shifting more from a process to a regularity approach to causation, or that the regularity ones are better than the process ones. I think it's interesting that in addition to all his other advances in probabilistic thought, Darwin should be credited with this first glimmer of understanding causal probabilities, of how dependencies and independencies relate to causal inference. And furthermore, I think the argument from independence is powerful because it appeals to general principles of causal inferences, not particular assumptions about God's nature. I'm unclear about some of this, especially sort of how to drag this in the causal modeling territory, but we'll leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hayley. At this point, we ordinarily ask everyone to unmute and clap your hands. So in appreciation for Hayley, let's do it. Hayley, that was great. Thank you so much. We are going to take a short comfort break, as Ellen said at the start. So let's come back in 3 minutes' time, and we'll begin. If you have a question, if you could